What are Paul's parting words to the Colossians? That's what we're going to talk about today. All right, well, we have seen just an incredible message. We have talked about slaves and masters and parents, fathers and children, and wives and husbands, and angels, and things that really matter to the Lord and things that don't matter to the Lord. Paul continues on to say, masters, deal with your slaves justly. We talked about this the last time, right? That if you were, now this is not the slave word, this is going to be the bondservant word. And we are, in a sense, when we do a job, bondservants. I am going to give you 8 hours of my time and you're going to give me money and I am going to trade that with you. Bondservants were a little bit like that, although the deal was a little bit different. Bondservants are supposed to do their jobs because they are working for the Lord. The Lord is watching them. Now we talk about these people who have the bondservants. Treat them justly and fairly because you have a master in heaven too. We love it that God treats us with grace and forgiveness, but do we do that to other people? And are people who are the masters of these bondservants, are these people who are bosses, remembering that they have someone who is the boss of them? And I like this because I don't want people to misread what's going on. Like I said, that the idea is that when you negotiate parts of your life, right, because you need money or maybe you wanted a plot of land, they entered into this servitude relationship. We do the same thing where we want to get income. We offer ourselves in service to another company, another person. We work for them, and we are trying to basically get something out of that particular relationship. So this is rooted way back. I don't want to get into the deep details of it, but Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15. And it says that if a servant, these bondservants decided that they truly found a home, that they care for this family, they can make the permanent choice to stay with that family. So they would go to the doorpost of the house and the master would get an awl. That's AWL. It's a sharp metal tool, and pierce the servant's ear against the doorpost. And from that moment on, that person was no longer a bondservant. They, working to pay off a debt or working, for a specific person. They have chosen to become part of that family, a permanent member of the household that they served in. They still didn't own property. They still served. They didn't own property, but they were part of the family. They belonged. And that's the context that what Paul is speaking into, where he says, masters, deal fairly and justly, with your bondservant. This person has chosen you. They are in your home, under your care. Treat them like that because you have a master in heaven yourself, and don't forget that. And you're accountable to God about how you treat people under your roof. I think that means also, if you're a boss, you're accountable to how you treat people under your service, whether it's in a company or a job too. And this is a radical thinking in the world of Rome. Roman society, masters almost had absolute power over those people below them. You signed a deal, you can do whatever you want. But Paul is saying here, no, you're not at the top of the chain. You have someone to answer to and act like it. Paul then goes on to tell them that they should devote their lives to prayer with an alert mind and with thanksgiving. I don't know, people get this idea that somehow faith is not involved in the mind, but we don't get that image from Paul at all. He is also saying that, we hope that they pray for them, that God would open up the word, to other places, open that door so that they can proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I'm in chains. Remember, Paul is in chains in prison at this point, and he is asking for their prayers so that he has more opportunities. He is not looking at prison as this end of his ministry. He is looking at ways he can have opportunities. So this is something that Paul has always looked for. He could write letters. He was confined. He was uncomfortable. He's still imprisoned. But he had more freedom in that dungeon than he would have to talk to people outside of the dungeon. And so here he's writing this idea, this theologically rich New Testament letter that is still with us today And he is doing that inside of a prison. But he's looking for an open door, not to let him out of prison. In 1 Corinthians 15 and 2 Corinthians 2, it was a metaphor for him to be able to reach others with the gospel. The irony is not lost in this. The man in chain is asking for an open door, not to be set free, but a chance to speak to other people. And the third reason I love this particular one. He said, so that I may make it clear as I ought to speak. Not that he gets to speak, but he's saying that he wants to be clear, that this mystery of Christ, it comes through the way it should come through. He wants to make sure that he is able to talk to people. I think about that a lot these days as, I have this podcast, or I bet you your pastor thinks about this too. Anyone, who is trying to share their faith to somebody else, carry that sort of same hope in their heart. Am I saying this the right way? Am I making this clear? And if yes, then whoever that person is in your life, pray for them. Pray for your pastor. Pray for me. Pray that that door may be open to them, that they can walk through it, but that also that they have the clarity and the truth so other people can hear them accurately. Colossians 4, 5 through 6 then goes on to say, walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, that the person may know how you ought to answer each person. Making that best of your time is a translation that is redeeming time. The Greeks use that word and to say that it's a marketplace word, and it means buying something up, seizing it before someone else can. Getting it before someone else can. Right? There's a sale. There's only 3 left on the on this shelf. I want to go get that. The image of a savvy merchant who recognizes a good deal and jumps on it before the moment passes. That's how Paul says that we should be approaching every opportunity we have to speak about Christ to the people around us. And then that image, I'm always intrigued by these salt images, seasoned with salt. In the ancient world, salt was precious. There's a really great book called Salt that talks about how it was the very first commodity in the world. Now we think of oil or diamonds or gold. Salt used to be that thing. It preserves meat. It flavors things. It makes things more appetizing. We die without salt. And so Paul isn't saying salty in a modern sense of the word, like you're sharp or bitter, like we're salty people. He is saying, make your words worth hearing. Make them so that people want to keep listening to them. And that's what I find the most interesting thing. And then he says another interesting phrase at last, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Not each crowd, each person. I worked for a Christian organization for a number of years, and I got to meet a lot of people who shared the gospel all over the world, famous missionaries, and some of them not so famous missionaries, or ordinary college students who were just doing their thing. And the thing I noticed about them is they each had a different way of talking to people. And that's not dishonest and not fake. It's just aware that everyone sort of has their own way to them. As I work on this project, I find my own way of talking to people about God. And it's hard. Some people are real happy campers and love to chat and talk. And other people are, standoffish and don't want to talk. I tend to think of myself, I'm friendly. I keep the energy up. I like to stay engaged. I love to talk to people. You can probably see that about me. But there's other people who don't want that. They want professionalism, no facts, no jokes, no small talk, just clarity. And if I walk in that person's world with my cheerful project manager energy going on, I can sometimes lose them. So it's not about being two-faced. It's about being wise, understanding how that person in front of you ticks. That person's a real human being with their own personality, with their own way that people deal with other people. And that's what Paul means here, is the gospel doesn't change, the truth doesn't change, but the way that you open that door to the truth that can really shape and transform the person standing right there in front of you. It's going to be different for different kinds of people. That's the idea. For me, I never really connected with heaven as a concept, just, in my life before. And it sounds strange. And it sounds strange to say that when I came to faith, I came to faith not really understanding this promise of heaven. I didn't understand what it was. I didn't understand if it was real. Honestly, that was my last doubt when I became a Christian. Is heaven really real? A lot of people need to wrestle, with something. Everyone needs to wrestle with something. It's going to be completely different for other people. The comfort of knowing that there is something more out there, the comfort of knowing that there's a life outside of this life, that opens up their hearts. For others, the idea that God loves them and never gives up on them, never quits, never runs out on them, that's meaningful to them. Everyone sort of has a slightly different door. And wisdom, I believe, is finding exactly what that door is. It's all true. Every piece of it's true, but finding how you connect with that person. So then we get the final part of Colossians where he gives the greeting, which comes at the end. And he says, first there's Tychicus. Sorry, I'm really bad at Roman names or Greek names. I spend time looking up these pronunciations, but anyway, and then I hit the recording button and it's just gone. Paul calls him a beloved brother, a faithful minister, and a fellow servant in the Lord. And so he's sending Tychicus to the Colossians so that they can understand how Paul and his companions are doing. So sending them with news, encouraging words, and, there to help them. He is going to be the person that's going to be able to carry, he's probably the person who carried this letter from Rome to the Colossian people. There's Onesimus, which Paul calls a faithful, beloved brother, and he's someone who was from Colossae, this area. And he is a name that we're going to hear a lot more of because we're going to hear about him in the book of Philemon. He is most certainly a slave mentioned here, and the whole story gets involved, and we're going to get into it a little bit later. Paul's sending him back to Colossae along with the other guy, and he vouches for him warmly. And then there's this guy named that's Aristarchus, and this is a fellow prisoner with Paul. It is well-documented figure in the New Testament. He was from Macedonia and Thessalonica. People say that differently too. And he traveled with Paul extensively. We see him in Acts 19 and Acts 20. He's on the ship in Acts 27 in that famous storm. And now he's been with Paul in this prison alongside him. And then there's Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, who is, yes, John Mark, the same person who wrote the Gospel of Mark. And I should clarify something that actually is sort of debated in the scholarly world, that Mark's Gospel was written probably either before or after this letter. That makes sense. But scholars tend to date the Gospel of Mark around 65 to 70 AD, before the destruction of Jerusalem. So the Colossians was written probably somewhere in 50s, early 60s. So we can't say definitively that the Gospel of Mark was written before this letter. We do know that Mark had a complicated history with Paul. He left a missionary journey early. We don't know why. Did he get scared? Did something happen? There's a tradition in history that there was a time that Mark lost his faith for a period. He started to travel with Peter. Peter brought him back. And so the Gospel of Mark is probably the Gospel of Peter for the most part. We don't know for sure, but we know that some sort of a serious rift happened between Paul and Mark and Barnabas, that it actually split. They split up at that chapter. Barnabas wanted to give Mark another chance. Paul did not, and they went their separate ways. So here in this letter, he comes out and welcomes him. The rift is healed. Paul and Mark are reconciled. And that's worth noting, that Paul, who was firm enough about Mark that he wanted to end their travels together, now is extending him a welcome. So it's a fun tradition about Mark and the Gospel of Mark itself. There is a young man who shows up. First of all, the young man shows up with a canister of water. The apostles were supposed to follow him back up to the upper room. That became the Last Supper of Christ. that water basin maybe was used for the washing of the feet that Jesus did. Then that young man was there at the arrest of Jesus. When the soldiers tried to grab him, they grabbed the cloak and the mark went that away and he ran off. And so early scholars believed that that's Mark himself writing himself into his own gospel. We can't approve it, things to ask in heaven, but it's kind of a cool thing. So there you go. And then there's a person named Jesus who's called Justice, not justice like a sense of justice, like Justin. And Paul mentions him briefly and says that he and Aristarchus and Mark have been a comfort to him. And so this man is easily overlooked, but it's kind of interesting because he is one of a small number of Jewish Christians that Paul specifically names as a fellow worker in this point of his ministry. Most of the people that Paul mentions are Gentiles in a time when the Jewish-Gentile dynamic in the church was still being worked out. There were some good places and some bad places. So it's kind of an interesting reference. Then there's Epaphras, who is the man who people believe founded this church at Colossae, at least planted the seeds of it, traveled all the way to Rome to find Paul to let him know how this church was doing, probably to say, look, there are some things going on I don't know how to deal with. And essentially, was he a prisoner? Was he a visitor and helped stay to visit Paul? We don't know. But he made it there, told Paul what was going on, and this letter was a result of that conversation he had. Paul says that he is struggling on behalf of the Colossians in his prayers, and you may stand mature. He hopes that they stand mature, fully assured of God's will. That's a pastor's prayer, a prayer of someone who sees that the church is going well, but he can't rest until he knows they're okay. He went all the way to Rome because of people he loved there. Paul notes that Epaphras worked hard, not just for the Colossians, but for the neighboring cities of around them, and that these other cities were prosperous cities. But there was a major earthquake that devastated the entire region, somewhere around 60 to 61 A.D. Laodicea had enough money to rebuild. Epaphras was caring for this whole region. So I think that what happened eventually is this area became in financial struggle, and primarily because Colossae used to be a wealthy community and no longer didn't have that kind of money, but he's caring for this whole region. Luke, the beloved physician, that's going to be the same Luke who wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And just a hello there. And just a quiet hello there. And then there's Demas, who is mentioned here without any sort of discussion. It's interesting because in 2 Timothy 4, Paul will later write with sadness that Demas has deserted me, having loved this world. So right now, he is in fellowship with this church. But later on, it's going to be a sad note in a future letter. Paul sends his greetings to the brother in Laodicea and Nympha, who also had a church meeting in her house. And the idea is that the woman, Nympha, was a woman. She's hosting a church. The early church was housed in people's homes. There's no church buildings for a long time yet to come. And a woman like Nympha played a crucial role in recognizing that this church, these communities needed a place to meet. And so they were gathering in these places and able to communicate together. So Paul gives her a shout out, and she is also a mention in Colossians 4:16 through 17, where there was an exchange of letters. So this is really fascinating, where it says, this letter has been read to you among you so that you may read it to the churches in Laodicea. So that's going to be at her house. And when you see that letter reference, it's mentioning basically the home church that's there in her house. So this letter that was sent to Laodicea is lost to history. We don't know what it contains. Some scholars have proposed that it might be a letter that we call the letter to Ephesians, but we don't know because there was no specific city addressed in there. And maybe it's circulated in multiple churches. So again, something that we can find out in heaven. But at the very final part, he says, say this to Archippus, see that you fulfill the ministry that you have received from the Lord. So he's getting called out in this letter about something that's being read out to the entire congregation. And some scholars think that this might be Philemon's son. And that would give a connection to him when we get into that future letter that talks about this relationship Paul had, that he knew a task that had been given to this man, a ministry entrusted in him, and maybe he just needed a little nudge. So maybe it's just a word of encouragement or a moment of accountability or maybe both of those things. But this letter is delivered in front of everybody. So it's something pastoral. Maybe it's a little uncomfortable. It's not a private note. It's a public word. But maybe that is gentle enough to say, you make sure you see fulfilled what is been given you to do. Very end, Paul says in his own hand that he is greeting with my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be to you. So this last sign-off is in Paul's own handwriting. He did not probably write the whole letter himself. It actually means that he just wrote the very bottom part of it. It was standard convention in that time that you would translate a letter dictated to a scribe, a trained writer. Not everyone could write. And at the very end, you would take the pen in your own hand and write the closing yourself. Sort of an authentication. This is my signature. This is really coming from me. This is genuine. It's not a fake letter. And so Paul does that in several of his letters. In Galatians, he says, see, with the large letters I'm writing to you in my own hand. 2 Thessalonians 3:17, he calls it a mark in every letter. He's doing this in a personal handwriting. So he says, at the end, remember his change. Don't forget, he is in prison. And don't forget the cost of all of this, that this letter came to you from a man in chains, chained to a soldier, under guard, unable to leave, and then wrote, grace be with you. That ends the books of Colossians. What I'm going to meditate on is this idea that we should always be gracious to people, seasoned with salt, making our words worth hearing to them, appealing to them, that we know how to answer each individual person. This isn't about being dishonest, like I said, or putting on a mask. It's about being genuine, but understanding how to communicate with another individual. For me, I never connected with that idea until I started, like I said, doing this Bible podcast. And then I understand the question, who am I trying to connect with? This is actually all real. What am I trying to say? And how am I trying to connect that with other people? One person's door is another person's discomfort. One person's love, might be disturbing to someone else. And everyone just comes with a little bit different manner to God. Wisdom means something a little bit different to them. And so that means you don't change the meaning. What you do is you understand that other person. And what I'm going to pray is that the Holy Spirit gives me this ability to see how each person relates to God, that I make it clear to them what God is about, that I'm capable of explaining this so that it is clear what Jesus wants, just like Paul asked for, that I don't just get to speak, but I get to speak it correctly. And that's what I'm going to pray about. And what I'm going to share with others is this idea, this list of names that Paul gives at the end of the letter. Look at this community. Faithful travelers who were in prison with Paul, people who traveled back and forth, a slave person, a woman who owned her own house and hosted a church, Mark, a man who stumbled somehow and was restored. There's wealthy civic leaders, humble servants, and famous apostles. And history, there's a lot of people that history doesn't record at all. Paul's church had them all. The early church needed them all, and the people needed the church. That's where we're at right now. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you listening. Put a comment in below and say hi, or email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. Love to hear from you. I hope this is going well for you. You can find all my podcasts at jillfromthenorthwoods.com. I have some podcast about nature, another one about productivity, I hope that you join me in whatever fits your life, that you're doing great, and I appreciate you being there.